behind the scenes, it was a small group of people that were doing everything.
Welcome back to the GTM Podcast. It's your host, Scott Barker.
I want to know how this insane growth actually happened.
Welcome, everyone, to the GTM Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Barker, co-founder and partner at GTM Fund. I guess this is number one, so I got to do a little bit of housekeeping, tell you what this is all about. So we launched this podcast. The GTM Podcast is going to be a weekly story-based podcast where well-known tech execs, VCs, and founders are going to come up and dissect a career story that they're proud of. We're going to discuss what worked, what didn't work, and get a behind-the-scenes look at how shit really went down. And we want this to be interactive too. So that's part of the reason we're doing this, is to get back to the tech community. So listeners will actually have a chance to get involved and ask candid questions to our guests. So don't hold back. Send your toughest questions to questions@gtmfund.com. And you might just make it on the show. So this podcast is specifically for anyone, whether you're an operator or a founder or a VC looking to scale and grow your technology business. And I'll tell you, we've got one hell of a first guest lined up, Mr. Mark Cranney. How we doing?
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. I love it. Well, it's great to see you again, my friend. And thank you for jumping on and being the first guest. You know, the last time we were together, which was also the first time meeting you in person, we had a little bit of fun together. We had a nice dinner at Roca Accor, went out with a handful of folks after, took to the mean streets of SF. There might have been a dive bar involved. Don't think I got home till about 2 a.m. that night, but it was a good time.
I was home way earlier, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
It actually is coming back to me now. Yeah, you're right.
It was a late one.
My favorite Canadian.
I love it. Thank you. I do remember, I think I got home around 2, was up at 7, which is a little bit later than I normally would get up. And I texted you. I wanted to be like, hey, man, had a great time. I believe you were already completely ready to rock on your way to a board meeting, if I remember correctly. So that solidified in my mind that this guy's just built different. Where does all that energy come from?
Probably genetics. So, and maybe a little environment.
Well, I've coined you the revenue Viking since that evening, and I hope you're cool with that nickname. Yeah, I mean, really no need for long introductions. I'll do one anyway. I would suggest everyone go and take a look at some of the work Mark Cranney's done. But Cranney is an enterprise go-to-market operator and 3-time unicorn creator. Most recently, he was the COO at Skydio, where he led all operations and go-to-market for the company. Prior to that, he was COO at Signal FX, which was acquired by Splunk. I was also the founding operating partner at a little firm called Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. And you own the whole market development team, where you helped hundreds of portfolio companies scale and also accelerate their time to market by creating thousands of opportunities. You also led worldwide field operations for Opsware, also acquired by HP. You can see there's a pattern here of acquisition, and Aster Data Systems, which was acquired by Teradata. Cranney, I believe you were recruited to Silicon Valley by Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen themselves to join Opsware after being VP of Americas at Boston-based Parametric Technology Corp. And there's 2 books. So kind of your company building skills at Opsware are actually in the books, The Hard Thing About Hard Things and What You Do Is Who You Are, which is pretty cool. So maybe let's start there. You know, the hard thing about hard things, beyond just the book and what it's trying to teach, like, what does that title mean to you?
Well, I mean, that's kind of Ben Horowitz's story around the Opsware time frame. He also carries on some of that story in his What You Do Is Who You Are book. His examples around building winning cultures. But so I mean, I was recruited by Ben and Mark. It's well chronicled in really both books. It was they were in a tough spot. It was a long story how I ended up coming there, but the big thing was, Ben and I clicked very early on, which again is chronicled in the book, the second book, how that story came to be. Even though it was a complete redo from their Loud Cloud days, the early days of the cloud, and they had to pivot into a enterprise software company, and really needed massive change, outside leadership to come in and put the kind of the competitive culture and processes and people in place to go build an enterprise culture versus what they'd been operating under before, which is a lot more, I would say, inbound and momentum driven. So
I love it. And that's part of what I want to talk to you about today. And again, this is going to be story based. So we're going to dive into a story that kind of highlights competition. But before we get there, I do want to, take a little bit of time, talk about something that's topical in tech news, things that are happening this week. And I'm kind of coining it the great shakeup. I don't know if you're noticing this, but whether it's all on the backs of, the recession, or people having just more time to reassess their lives in a post-COVID era. But everywhere I look, it seems like great leaders are making a move, whether that is going to start their own business, leaving larger companies to go to smaller startups again. And it seems like a trend that's really accelerating. And I would love your take on this. Like, what do you make of it all? Is this going to be ultimately a net positive for the tech sector once this plays out?
Well, I mean, I think if you go back in history, and I'm old enough, definitely dating myself to back to the been through several of these in the early days of my career. Oil busts and S&L crises. Coming right out of college, started my career in the bottom of a recession. If you look at the dot-com era and coming out of that, there's a lot of lessons and movement that went on there. A lot of people had flooded to, the startup world prior to that. And when things crashed, in the 2001 range, there was a flight to safety. If you fast forward to the financial crisis in, 08, 09, similar type of wipeout happened, and you saw a lot of movement there. And I think, we're in the early innings, I think, of what's going on today. We've had a long upward cycle. Things, were, I wouldn't say it's never easy, but easier than in the past. A lot of super high valuations, and the COVID situation, I think, that preceded what's going on right now and inflated everything is, a lot to do with it. And the whole work-life balance thing is, definitely an issue right now. And I think, there'll be a lot of turnover here in the upcoming quarters and years, and, the strong will rise to the top again. The people moving into the earlier stage type situations, taking more risk, and if they're the right people and the right, have the right, playbooks in place, if they can build the right teams, then, those are the ones that will rise to the top. So I just view it as another cycle. Nothing too special or spectacular about it. It's just, what comes up goes down, and what goes down eventually comes back up. So Mother Nature.
That's how it goes. And I don't know if it's just a proximity bias, because I talked to earlier stage companies and, work with a lot of operators that are going. But it's interesting. You said something like a flight to safety, which in my mind would be a trend to like maybe larger, more stable companies. But at least what I'm seeing is almost an opposite reaction. Some people are really seeing this as an opportunity. Okay, it's time to go build, and that's interesting.
Yeah, I think this one might be a little different in that regard. If you're sitting on the bigger slower moving company, less innovation side of the fence, being stuck in a, Zoom calls for, 16 hours, wherever you've been, big, small, medium sized company is, it's been a little traumatizing. The lack of, customer reaction, the last of, having teammates and all that stuff going on. The whole, a lot of the processes have changed as far as, in-person sales calls versus the over online. But I think people, work themselves silly, for a few years in this COVID environment and, reassess their situations and, time to move on in a lot of cases. So, and it's been a tight labor market, but, I think that, that'll loosen up here the next, again, I think it's early innings. I think it's going to, shake out a little differently maybe than the past, but you'll see a lot of the same things going on.
Yeah. I'm maybe an eternal optimist, but I think the new blood, new eyes, new vigor again, on new problems, ultimately, that's how we're going to get out of this on the other side. All right. So we could talk about just about anything due to your background. You've seen it all. But as I was kind of preparing for this conversation, I kept going back to this idea that you already brought up, and it's competition. And, we could talk about RevOps, we could talk about finance, fundraising, scaling, hiring, leadership, you name it. But when I thought about it, and I guess like the truth is, I don't think I'd want to compete with you. And I'm one of the most competitive people on this planet. But head to head with the Revenue Viking, I don't think that's a place you want to be. And I think people sort of shy away from this topic. But at the end of the day, in 99% of situations, you're going to find yourself head to head with other leaders and other companies in your category, unless it's a very rare situation. And I'd love to dissect the story of yours that highlights how you either beat, turned the tide, or kept your competition on their back foot. What are the strategies you used? What worked? What would you do differently?
I mean, I have a lot of them. I've probably been more attracted to the highly competitive type situations, and have definitely done a lot of deals. The good one that's well chronicled is, Opsware is a company that was, behind. They had a competitor, Blade Logic, out of Boston that was way ahead of them, product wise and go to market wise, and this was a company that was, had pivoted from a service provider to an enterprise software company, and they're getting their butts kicked, and they're getting their butts kicked by some, a lot of guys that I knew, ex-PTC sales leadership, chairman of the board, ex-PTC as well. It actually attracted me to the deal that, hey, this is a chance to test my mettle, be able to go in and with a fairly blank sheet of paper or a license for a blank sheet of paper and install and build, put the playbook in that I knew would work in this situation, customize that playbook, be able to hire the right teammates to go execute that playbook, and get very granular in the process and, unpacking strengths and weaknesses, what's comparative versus differentiated with, the competitors, and, get down to, granular detail and execution on beating a competitor. So that's one story. I mean, they're way behind. Fast forward to, a couple companies ago, Signal FX was a similar story. Another big competitor, probably way further ahead than Signal FX. Figuring out, it was a company called Datadog, which has gone on to be public and do extremely well. Very well run company, top to bottom. Again, a bunch of sales leaders that really knew what they were doing. A lot of similar DNA to where I'd come from. I looked at it as a challenge, figuring out where their weaknesses were and where our strengths were, and going right at them and exploiting that as best we could. And when you're smaller and you need to be scrappier and you need to be more targeted, and you need to be very careful on how you exert your limited resources to execute, a competitive strategy, and your processes have to be extremely sound. And the people that are running those plays and processes have to be, the right fit, the right culture fit, and they have to, be people that gravitate to competition and aren't going to shy away from it. So there's a toughness factor that's involved there. You and your leadership, across go to market, whether it's sales, marketing, customer success, product, whatever it is, need to have a great recruiting eye and understand, am I bringing in the right type of people and the right kind of culture fit that are going to thrive in a competitive environment, or are they going to crumble, right? And there's ways of doing that, in a recruiting process. Some of that's, going back, you kind of break it into three buckets. Do they have the track record of displaying a competitive bent? Can they prove it? Whether that's, exceeding quotas, top 5 or 10% and where they've been before, or if you're hiring, kids right out of college, what's their, track record there as far as being in competitive environments. That might be, intercollegiate athletics, it might be student government, it might be, the president of the sorority, right? Who knows? But whatever that track record is, and then, the second bucket I'd kind of consider is more the character issues. Are they focused? Are they disciplined? Are they, do they have kind of the woo to get people to rally around them? Whether that's customers, their teammates, and the third bucket is just what's their golden spur? What's driving them? Why do they want or need to be successful? And that's probably the little tougher one to answer. But I think you can do that, in an interview process to kind of see what, if this is the right type of culture fit, and are they going to be able to run the playbook that you put in place? So
lots to unpack there. Let's go back to the Opsware example. So you're now in this competitive environment. You're on the back foot with Blade Logic, and it sounds like you were able to find some really good talent to join you. And you look at the track record, you look at character, you look at their golden spur. Once you got those people on board, how did you, and hopefully these people are intrinsically motivated, but there's going to be tough times in competition where you're going up and you're doing an enterprise deal and your tech's not completely where it needs to be. It can be demoralizing. How did you keep that fire lit all the time?
I think process triumphs heroics anytime, and probably one of the keys that's, I think, easier to get your hands around as a leader and or a potential leader is the playbook and teaching that playbook. And you can use sports analogies, but there's a system you need to come to the table with, and then you got to be able to customize that system. And the quickest way of putting together I think a winning culture and a system is to come with a playbook, processes, and then train and enable your teammates to go execute that process. So what I have always done is put together a new hire boot camp is the first thing I've always done. New hire boot camp, 4.5, 5-day type training program in person, right? In the last, during COVID and all that stuff, you had to pivot to a online scenario, but essentially break that down into about 50% product and market type focused and get very granular. And it's a whole team that needs to come together to do this, unpacking the value proposition, the segmentation and targeting of your market, that's marketing, your product gaps, your competitive differentiators, your roadmap to close those gaps and to extend your competitive differentiators, put together a whole competitive playbook or series of playbooks depending on the competitors you're dealing with. It could be the big, slower moving incumbents that own most of the market. It could be the up and comers like yourself that have strengths and weaknesses and having different plays for that. And then stepping through that whole process and doing that in a simulated environment for every new hire, and very granular and stopping multiple times a day, and not just having them see your content and regurgitate it, but stop, in all steps of the sales process with all the tools and deliverables that are customer verifiable, and make them use that in a simulated environment with case studies of actual deals you've done, has been one of the most important things that I implemented in pretty much all the companies I did. And at Andreessen Horowitz, I actually put this together as for all the portfolio companies in our portfolio, that they could come in and, in a condensed type scenario, go through this, what we call go-to-market boot camp. So, younger, up and coming, technical, in a lot of cases, technical, founders that didn't have a lot of go-to-market time on bike could come in and see what this whole process looks like, and what are the stages and gates and functions and deliverables that a startup needs to build out over time. What's kind of what you need early versus mid stage versus later stage, helps kind of open their eyes up to what's required going forward, as they, gain product market fit and start to scale things up, all the way down to, what are the, secrets and deliverables and tricks to, and criteria to hiring great talent, and performance managing that talent, and making sure you're building the right winning culture, processes, and the team, that's needed to go execute that. So the boot camp, I think it skipped a lot of cases, and it skipped at go-to-market executives' peril if they don't properly train, put that system in, and they're not granular with that system. If they just kind of think it's going to happen over time, I mean, you lose a lot of productivity time by not getting people up and running quickly. And I really think it could be boiled down to what I'd call a 4x4. It's all about competence, and there's 4 different levels of competence. You're unconsciously incompetent, you become consciously competent, or you're unconsciously incompetent. You don't know early on, then you become consciously incompetent. If you train early and often, you'll get your people consciously competent. You want to get everybody to unconscious competence as quick as possible. What that gives them is confidence right out of the chute. And as a seller or a marketer, even in the customer success world, you want confidence in your people to get your message across. And if you can get them, consciously competent in a very short period of time, your time to productivity is going to be a lot shorter. And putting somebody else out there as in an OJT, on the job training type scenario, and waking up 6, 9, 12 months later, it's not a great experience for the employee. It's also not a great experience for the company, if it's not a fit. And, running people through these simulations early on, and essentially it's boot camp, right? Some people might not make it through boot camp. Maybe we made a mistake. It may not be the right culture for you. Right? But let's give them all the tools, deliverables, training that we can possibly do, and constantly be iterating on this. Because if we're a young, growing, expanding, scaling company, we're constantly going to be turning the knobs and tweaking that and getting more granular, getting better against our competition. The biggest competition in a lot of cases is do nothing, and there's always going to be gaps, and it's a great forcing function for the company to grow and scale as well. So both from a people standpoint and a process and deliverable and messaging standpoint.
Process triumphs heroics. I like that one. Is that a Mark Cranney TM? Are we trademarking that one?
I'm sure I stole it from somebody. So
everything's been said. Someone said everything better.
Plenty of quips out there. So
here's my next question. I love this idea of unconscious, competency. When going back again, Opsware, Blade Logic, when did you feel like, oh shit, I think we just pulled them into our game? And what were some of the levers you think that you pulled when the tables turned and it felt like, oh shit, I think we're up on these guys right now?
To get way more granular. It probably took 9 months, but that's the people and the process and a lot of work on the product side, partnering up with Ben and all right, we've got these deficiencies, these gaps that we need to close. But in the meantime, it took a few months to figure out what those were and what our strengths were. In all my sales processes that I've laid out, there's two big buckets that are heavy focused on the competitive piece. In fact, I carved out a whole separate section and stage with Gates, called executing a competitive strategy before the next phase, which I'd call technical validation event. If you can't, the winning general kind of knows what the outcome's going to be before the war or the battle even starts. I mean, this is all Sun Tzu type stuff, but deep positioning, laying traps, understanding, and even before that, understanding and qualifying who your competitors are and or will be is super important, and laying that groundwork to win and understanding buyers' criteria is super important, and building what I would call kind of lockout criteria internally. We call it a lockout document, or what is the buying criteria. And so these types of deliverables, building a lockout document, pre-positioning that, here's it's our job really to know how to tell you as a customer how to evaluate newer technology that you might not be familiar with. Think of the whole concept of DevOps, and how the development of software has changed over time versus the old days, which was kind of over the wall process, from dev to ops type process, monolithic type applications, to change being happened all the time. The Opsware days, whether it was then or whether it was the Signal FX or Skydio days, or a lot of the other companies I worked with, as portfolio companies like the Okta guys, developing this competitive strategy, putting together a very detailed, granular technical validation event process, coupling that with an ROI diagnostic, and making any proof of concept we did be a proof of value by combining that proof of concept with a business case is super important. That business case piece, not as important as to maybe the technical buyers, but for the economic buyers, super important. And that answers that last question that you typically have to answer to get any types of change done or deals done, is why should I do it now versus all the other options I have? Why should I do anything? Why you over your competition? And then why now, including that competition of do nothing, right? So you have to answer all three of those questions. And the better job you do putting together a process to help a customer evaluate your technology, evaluate a business case, and help them get to, why you, and then why now. I think too many companies take too many shortcuts, too many leaders, skip a lot of steps, don't put all the process in place, don't put all the training in place, maybe don't, stick to their guns from a recruiting eye standpoint and a recruiting criteria standpoint. And it's, you're going to slow yourself down if you don't put all this stuff together and you don't manage it at a very, very granular level. And there's nothing more beautiful than knowing that you're going to win the deal before you really get into the deal, right? It's just the right fit. You've done a good job pre-positioning. You're negotiating along the way on what that process is going to be to evaluate you as a potential partner. And if you're doing a great job there at all levels, the CXO level, at mid-level management, where you got to cross over a lot of different departments, and then down at the evaluator level, the users or user managers. I mean, those are three different sets of criteria, buying criteria. And if you're not getting granular on that and in your personas and what's important to them, and have situational awareness and recognition, you're going to end up with a very spotty win rate, right? Tracking your win rates is super important. It's one of the big things we did at Opsware very on. It's pretty obvious, but we started, I mean, said day one, we're going to start tracking the win rate. When I was interviewing with them, I was like, what's your win rate? And it wasn't very good. Why? Right? Let's unpack that. Right? Is it product? Is it process? Is it people? What is the problem? Right? And it was all the above. Right? So you got to unpack that. And then you got to go where you can win, particularly when you don't have a lot of arrows in your quiver. You've got to make sure you're spending time in the right places from a segmentation and targeting standpoint until you build up the muscle when you can expand into other scenarios.
Well, that was gold. I mean, these three pillars. Would you coach people to go in that order? So, and I think you flipped one, at least in my experience, that a lot of leaders have differently. So you said execute a competitive strategy. So you better know who you're competing against before you step in the ring. You know, that's one. And then only then you would do a technical validation event. And then you're going to go and spend the resources and executives' time and AE's time on an ROI diagnostic. Would it go in that, or is it all one?
You do it up front, right? It's all, why go in and do a proof of concept, right? If you know that the criteria is not lined up for you, right? Now, there's all sorts of variables that can be factored into here. I mean, do I have time to go change the criteria? It's all about criteria, right? And if you're walking into a scenario and you're doing, you know, I've always got very, very granular. I think one of the best leading indicators in an enterprise, you know, let's just say enterprise software sales motion is the technical validation event process. And I've instrumented, in fact, you know, at Signal FX, the guy that ran all of sales engineering and customer success for me, ended up, we customized Salesforce to go manage that whole process with the SEs, with the, you know, proof of concept test plan, with lockout type criteria at a very granular level. He created a whole company around this called Vivin, that literally it's Salesforce for the sales engineer. And if you're, you know, your leading indicators, how many demos you're doing, how many proof of concepts you're doing, what is your win rate? Are you winning technically, but you're losing the deal? That could be a scenario. You could actually lose technically and win a deal based on a lot of different variables. But if you can't, if you're walking into scenarios where your criteria isn't a fit, or there's a perception that isn't a fit, or somebody else has already got in front of you and gotten their criteria baked into the proof of concept, then why would you go enter it? You're better off spending your time somewhere else if you can't change it. Now, there's a whole list of things you can do to change it as well. You know, that's where the biggest part of the negotiation is going to happen pre-POC, in my humble opinion, and at least in these very highly technical, more complex selling situations. If you got a bottoms up, you know, freemium to premium, it's easy to try, you know, that might be a little different. But as you move up and you get into tougher environments, you move up market, meaning larger size companies, bigger incumbency positions, then you better get very granular on what your buying criteria, your customers' buying criteria is, and how you can go impact that.
Yeah.
So yes, put it in front, execute it for laying trap. You got to lay traps for the competition. Otherwise, if you're not laying traps, guess what? You're stepping in them. You're a Canadian. You know, you don't want to, you know, big bear traps, right? Wolves, whatever. I know you got a little Nord Indians as well, so
a little bit, probably more bear traps up that way. But I mean, it makes sense, right? It's like, if I'm entering a game of one-on-one basketball, it's probably helpful to know if I'm going against LeBron James or my kid brother's friend, you know, and I'm going to play that game very differently.
I'd use football as a better analogy for me. I played it, but think of, are you going to get out coached in the game by, Bill Parcells, right? I mean, there's a lot of it. Are you going to make there's a lot of adjustments that happen. There's so much preparation that goes into playing, so much scouting, so much tendencies and weaknesses. And, a lot of adjustments as the game's playing, and having situational awareness. You can actually feel and see, hey, we're not gonna. This doesn't sound like a good situation for us to go into. Applying kind of something tried and true, kind of came out of PTC Medic, right? That's a lot of that process. Do we have metrics? That's kind of teeing up. Can we have that ROI impact? Have we talked, we have contact with an agreement with the economic buyer. There's going to be a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, right? This is even something, we mutually agreed that we're going to go do this. We identified pain. Do we know the decision criteria? Do we know the decision process? I really identified the pain. Do we have champions, and have we eliminated the competition? I mean, those are the 2 C's on the end, right? So the 2 C's are very, very important. Without those 2 C's, you're in trouble, right? If you haven't built champions, and there's a lot of sellers just don't know the difference. They don't know the difference between a champion and a coach and a support, right? It's just, there's a lot of training and situational awareness, particularly for the up and coming sellers, that needs to happen. And then there's a lot of inspection that needs to happen from, particularly frontline sales management, or even, in a small startup scenario, your VP of sales, CRO, needs to be, have that situational awareness to understand, are we winning or losing? I think it's all simple for me. It's like, there's a clock and a scoreboard, right? You're forecasting that something's going to happen inside a quarter or in the next few quarters. You've got a clock and a scoreboard. How are you progressing through the campaign? What's the score and how much time you have? That's how the whole forecasting thing works. This is how a lot of CROs get, taken out, right? Is they can't manage the clock and the scoreboard. They can't forecast. They can't drive that process, or they don't have enough of that process and granularity to predict, right? And if you set the wrong expectations internally, it consistently, you're going to be, participating in the Great Resignation.
The great shakeup. That's
the great
the Canadian.
shakeup.
That's the Canadian nice version, I think.
Yeah, you're so nice. Sorry.
Sorry. All right. So clock and scoreboard. So switching it up a little bit, because there is an audience participation piece of this. I know we only have a couple minutes left. And the question that came in, and just so everyone knows, you can either do it anonymously or you can do your name and we'll shout you out. If it's too spicy, then we do it anonymous. This one has to be anonymous. And we kind of touched on this a little bit in the episode, but let's reiterate some of it. How do you create a culture of winning without turning your team's culture toxic?
Yeah, I think I really don't like the question, right? It's, if you're winning, I don't know, is it going to be a toxic culture? I think what it's kind of saying is, the questioner's like, I like to win, but I might not necessarily like all the things that need to be done to win. I'm taking a kind of a negative bent to the question. So I think you need to ask yourself look, am I joining a company and a team that I'm going to like to be around? And if it's a competitive culture, that I like that culture. If you don't like a competitive culture, there's a reason, some companies or teams or cultures are more competitive than others. It's needed, right? Is it a wartime situation or is it a peacetime situation? If you'd rather have work-life balance and be more of a peacetime situation, then there's plenty of places for you to go to not, be, where you might not feel you're going to be held accountable because you're not competitive enough, right? So I don't think there's a easy answer to that. Go to a culture, go to a team that you like to be around, right? And if that happens to be at the tip of the spear, the most competitive environment where, hey, these teammates I'm joining are off the charts competitive, right? And that's going to look toxic to some people. To some people that like that environment, that's like heaven, So, I mean, and anything other than that, if it's not a competitive environment, to me, for me, that's toxic, right? So that's, I think that's a personal decision, right? That you got to have accountability. Say, look, I joined this team. Well, this is what I signed up for. I didn't sign up for this extremely granular process, and I'm going to be inspected, and there's going to be a lot of help, and we need to win 80% of the time or 90% of the time, and we've got to do all this stuff to do it. If you don't like that type of environment, then go where it's easier. You gotta know it's not just the hiring authority's job. I mean, whoever's doing the hiring has to know what their hiring criteria is, but also whoever's joining needs to have their own criteria, and they really want, they need to want to do it the way that leadership, has laid out. I mean, it's a system. Is this a system I'm going to like or not? So it's two-way street. It's not a one-way street.
I agree. It reminds me of that Michael Jordan scene in his documentary where they're talking about how some of the guys didn't like to play in his system, and he literally starts crying because he's like, they didn't have to play in the fucking system. They could have opted out. They wanted to be the best. That's what it took to be the best, and it's a very powerful scene. And I agree with you. You gotta make the choice as a leader. Exactly.
You don't like the system, then last I checked. Now it might change. It was a free country, right? So you can always walk out and find something that works for you.
All right, Cranney, one last question I'm going to sneak in. And this is going to be a hard one because it's hard to distill an incredible career down to a few sentences. But if you can sum up your learnings in a few sentences, whether it's about what we talked about today or just general advice you would want to impart on folks, what would those sentences be?
From a leadership standpoint, there's a great quote: knows the way, goes the way, shows the way, right? So I think back to some of the topics we talked about, if you've got a playbook and you're a student of the game, I mean, my best advice is, that I've got along the way, be a student of the game, be a pro, not a schmo. I think a lot of, particularly the younger sellers come in and they're not students of the game, right? It's like, it's a job to them. But be a student of the game, practice, drill, rehearse. It's like my old man used to tell me very early age was, it's not what you're doing during the game or in the performance. It's what you do when no one's around, no one's looking. It's the practice, the drilling, and the rehearsing. It's that if you have 8 hours to chop down a tree, how are you going to use that 8 hours? Are you going to spend, 8 hours hacking away with a dull axe, or are you going to spend 7 of them sharpening the blade in an hour to chop the tree down, right? So the preparation, and if you think about, professionals or even collegiate sports or any sport or any type of competition, you're playing, or any performance. It could be music, writing. It's the thousands and thousands of hours before the performance that goes in, right? And am I getting 1% better every day, right? What are you doing when no one's around, no one's looking? Are you just showing up and doing the minimum, or are you approaching it like a pro, right? So, and that doesn't mean, hey, I need a mentor, teach me how to do this in 30 minutes. It's like, putting in the work, right? Really understanding what it's going to take, your competition, your company, your product, your market, your techniques, your processes, things of that nature, right? So that was just, growing up on a farm in a ranch and family business, and, I didn't have a choice, right? There were no shortcuts. If you take a shortcut, there's always a consequence, and it's usually not a good one.
When you take a shortcut, there's always a consequence. Agreed. Do the work behind the closed doors. Cranney, thank you so much, man, for all your wisdom and sharing your experience with us and the listeners. You're the man. I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate you taking the time. And, people got to hear the Revenue Viking playbook a little bit. And For all those listening, thanks for joining us as well. Listening is one thing, execution is everything. Go put some of this into practice, get out there and grow.